In the center of Mapleton's historic town square is a bronze sculpture entitled Unity by Tyson Snow. It represents a timeless story of a husband and wife toiling side by side, sharing each other's burdens, strengthening and encouraging one another. A strong wind pushes them from behind, representing life's abrupt or unexpected difficulties. For a brief moment, the work stops as the sudden gust hits. He drops the plow with one hand to stop his hat from blowing off. She leans her head towards his shoulder for support, shelter from the wind, and to keep dust from getting into her eyes. Her hand clasps the top of the seed bag so no seed is lost by the jarring elements. Eventually, they plan to harvest and enjoy the fruits of their labors together.
My great-great-grandfather, Richard Lovell Mendenhall, was one of the first settlers in Mapleton. The story is told that he slept in the ditch overnight so that he could get first dibs on the section of land that he was going to homestead. So he was one of the first ones here.
It's hard to go back, all the way back to when this story began. And Union Bench, which we now know as Mapleton, was formed by several farmers from Springville and Spanish Fork.
With faith in the law of the harvest, families first started coming to Union Bench in the 1850s, and a more permanent settlement was established in the 1870s. Nothing was here but raw, untamed land. No roads, no ditches, no water. They knew the only way to survive was to work together. Investing back-breaking labor, they broke up the hard soil, added important nutrients, and planted seeds. The seeds of strength for a strong community were planted by their shared struggle and reliance on each other, creating a pattern upon which future generations would follow.
It's interesting, they had no spare cash. Everything was dependent on whatever they got from their cash crops in the fall. But this is a story written by Hannah Bird Mendenhall. Quote, "It seems it must have taken a lot of courage to face this situation of pioneering, this new country both for father and mother. The ground had to be reclaimed and irrigated perfectly before crops could be raised. Sagebrush had to be grubbed from the ground. I can remember as a girl, 10 years old, of sagebrush still growing in the fields. Father unfalteringly conquered the soil and made this waste desert blossom as a rose after years of hard toil."
The problem with Mapleton, the only irrigation we had, when those first settlers started to come here, they had a little water out of Maple Canyon, but they had filed on some of the water from Hobble Creek. And so those old pioneers dug a ditch from Hobble Creek. It comes clear across the east bench of Mapleton and clear over onto the south, and they'd get the water every 30 days. But that was the way they initially started to farm up here. Mapleton still has rights to that Hobble Creek water.
William too, he had been working as a mason, and he decided he wanted to get into farming and work for himself. So he came over here with his wife and the one child, and they settled an area, and they had a little one-room house with a cellar underneath it. So he started fruit farming. He wasn't doing ranching and that, but he was doing fruit farming. He did have some cattle that he was raising.
And it was called Union because supposedly it was united. It just a united group in Springville that ran their place up here, and so they named it Union Bench.
This was prime country up here for farming, and by about 1856, as I recall, they began to call this Union Bench and was settled up here just a few years after Springville was.
It was all the United Order, like I think Brigham City, Orderville, and a lot of little towns in Utah were like that. They had sectioned off some land. They were able to get land from the federal government, a 160-acre homestead. And so, like Whiting's is from pretty much Main Street to the highway. I mean, it's big chunks of land.
My great-grandfather was the first one that lived in Mapleton, Oscar and Mary Whiting. I know that they acquired land from the government in the early 1800s.
My heritage, we have 4 generations. Brigham Young sent my family, Amos Sweet Warren, down to Mapleton to homestead, Mapleton and Springville area.
Now that I look back at it, it was a pretty amazing accomplishments what these folks did.
Like the seeds that were planted that grew into the peas, corn, or sugar beets, the community also grew. Families came from different cultures and traditions, making their own contributions to a growing town. They needed and depended on each other as they worked at the pea viner, harvested sugar beets, or secured water sources. One family's success was often entwined with everyone else's success. Many demonstrated their commitment through civic service, often making difficult infrastructure decisions that would support the needs of a growing community. They became a community of neighbors working together to grow life-sustaining crops while building a thriving community.
When I moved here, there were a lot of Italians. And the most that I shared water rights with and had pastures full of sheep were the John Bledgy and his family. And the Carnesecas had fruit orchards. And I was over to Carnesecas. I said, well, how did you guys end up in Mapleton from Italy? And he says, here's how it happens, Lee. We would come over and get jobs at Price in the mines. And some of the families even lived in tents, saving every penny. And so this is where they wanted to live as soon as they could buy land. And so they started getting together, and 5 or 6 of them would buy 20 acres here and 30 acres here. They like being here and they like to be part of this community, and they fit in really good, and many of them are still here today.
Well, my grandmother, she immigrated from Italy. She married a gentleman named Santo Bledgy. They first went from Italy, northern Italy, to Illinois, and then I think back to help her. And he died from black lung working in the coal mines. They had 8 children together. She lost her youngest in 1918, her husband in 1920, and her oldest son in 1922. My grandfather, he also immigrated from a different part of northern Italy. He married a woman that had 7 children, and they had 1 child, and that was my dad, Nino Antonino. And so he came up here to this area, and it reminded him of northern Italy with the mountains and the fields and everything else. He bought a farm and moved here actually in May of 1925.
I was raised by Elmer and Mary Wiscombe. We were raised on property that had also been owned and lived on by my grandparents. And in fact, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents all lived in Mapleton, and it was a comforting feeling to know that I was in surroundings that were shared by others that were my family.
I loved summers in Mapleton. My first memories are when there were just dirt roads. We went barefoot all summer, never wore shoes, only on Sunday. And there was only one oiled road, and that was Main Street. It was just a wonderful place to grow up.
When I was growing up, it was just the funnest place in the world. It was like how kids feel when they go to the circus.
I think Mapleton represents freedom. As a kid, we used to skinny dip in the reservoir up, which is now the pressurized irrigation reservoir, the canals that run through Mapleton, the ability to ride your bike wherever you wanted to, and have the ability to just go and do what you wanted to. As a child, I had a great childhood.
And we were kind of all family. It was surprising. The Mendenhalls and the Birds and the Whitings were still a prominent part of the Mapleton fabric even after I left home, and I'd come back to reunions and see my uncles and aunts and realize that, you know, just a generation ago they were little kids growing up in Mapleton too.
Our family, like so many families, was a farming family. Most of my friends, their dads were farmers. So our activities were kind of regulated by the weather and whether it was time to hoe the beets or hoe the corn or pick the cherries or whatever was happening.
Whether it was sugar beets, the sweet corn, the peas, whatever, it took a group effort because so much had to be done so quickly.
My dad was Elmer Wiscombe, and he was a hard working farmer. The only morning that we ever were up before he was Christmas morning.
I got up every morning and put an hour and a half to 2 hours of work in before I even got ready for school. And that's 365 days a year because we lived on a dairy farm. And I had a lot of classes that were like farm mechanics and stuff at 8 a.m. in the morning. You know, normal school didn't start till 9. I had to get the chores done, milk the cows and feed everything, you know. And then I'd run up the house and slide in the tub, get out, dry off, put on my school clothes. My mother would hand me an egg sandwich on my way to school. And that's the way I went most of the time. We had a quarter mile to get to the school bus thing, and a lot of times we ran it. And I was really good in the 440.
There were 2 cash crops that farmers relied on. One of them was sugar beets, and the other was peas. They built a viner over on 800 South and about 1200 West, and it was the largest viner in Utah at the time.
And the interesting thing about peas is, of course, there's a short time frame to get them done, and so there was a field manager that told us when it was time for ours to go, and he would tell us which days and what times we were to be to the pea viner with our loads.
Oh, the pea viner was a great place, and I remember we would help with the pea vines after the peas were put through and the peas were taken off, and I used to be up on the trumping it and making sure that pea vines that came through were stacked, and we just built it up as it was done. It was not a wonderful job, but it was a job. That's what we did. We were hard workers.
I remember as a kid we used to, something to do, we'd go over to the pea viner, and some of that pond that they had would get a crust on it. The game was to see who could run across the crust without breaking through. No one ever made it. Along the north side of the bench here in Mapleton had been settled by people who had come here from Italy. Good people, good friends. They were the fruit farmers. They developed great orchards over there, peaches and apricots and a lot of cherries.
Early in the spring, we would pick cherries. And the Karnasukis had an orchard. And they would come and gather up the kids that were going to pick. I was one of the kids that would get in the back of the truck, and he would haul us to his orchard. We'd pick up a ladder and we'd pick out a tree and we would start picking the cherries. Now this was the money maker for us. We were able to make 3 cents a pound, and if we were working hard, we'd get 100 pounds. That was a good day. So that's $3 we made.
We raised sugar beets, and we probably, a typical year, we probably had about 15 acres, I would say, of sugar beets. When they were first growing, of course, the first thing you had to do was thin the beets.
As soon as you got them thinned, you had to go back through it with a hoe and catch any doubles that had been left and hoe out any weeds. Then they'd cultivate them and water them. Then you hoed them again to get rid of any weeds or grass. Then came the job of harvesting them. And that was another community effort because it was a heck of a job to harvest those beets by hand.
Every person had a knife that was similar to this. This one happened to be my dad's, and he put a little wrist thing on here so that he could put this on here and secure this to his wrist so it was more secure. But this knife is sharp, and of course it has the point on, and they would just catch the beet and pull it up and put it over their knee and cut the top off. And then they'd throw the beet on a pile.
The last sugar beets I remember was a farmer by the name of Ned Larson, who had some, and he didn't get them out as early as he would like to have done. And I remember we had at least 20 guys over there to help him get his beets finished. They got frozen in, the ground froze, and you had to run them up onto a platform and be up there to beat the frozen dirt off from them, because you couldn't haul that much dirt down to the sugar factory. It was the whole community that came. There were 2 threshing machines in Mapleton. One of them was owned by Ralph Harmer and the other one by Fred Jensen. And they used to kind of share the work. Well, that was a big event when the thresher came. All the kids in the neighborhood came and watched them set up the thresher. It was always in the same place every year in a person's yard. Well, it took around a dozen people to do the threshing. You had 3 wagons and guys handling the grain. And the wagons, it was a team of horses and a wagon, and it'd take 3 wagons. So usually the farmer that they're thrashing his grain, he would have a wagon and have 2 neighbors that would come, and then when it was their turn, why, he'd take his wagon and go help them. And the same with the bundle pitchers out in the field that loaded the wagons.
Yeah, the old threshers, it was just before my time. I remember it, but it's kind of faint. My father was Paul M. Jensen. My dad was always called Bundle Pitching Paul, because he followed the thrasher. He'd go up towards Birdseye and around town in Mapleton and made a living.
Most of the harvesting projects were a community effort. For example, in our family, we had my dad and his brother and my grandpa all worked together. And so our families kind of formed a unit there, but it was not uncommon to have 2 or 3 other families help with the harvest of any of these crops.
Well, I always participated in it as much as I could, because you build your town, you know. What you invest in your time and effort into a town becomes it more, you know, of you. And if you see what you can extract, then all you're doing is hurting both sides.
They asked Daddy to be involved in incorporating the city. Up till then, Mapleton was not incorporated. In '49 was when they incorporated the city. And he became the first justice of the peace. And then he became the 2nd mayor. He wasn't a very popular mayor. And one of the reasons was he made everybody put in a water meter, because they used to have gunfights over the water. He was the first mayor that put in the gas lines. But they didn't go far enough south, so we never had natural gas in our house. We burned coal.
My father's grandfather bought the property that I grew up on, so it was in our family for a long time. My dad really loved this area. He had a real sense of the town and what was good for the town, and he was on the city council for a few years, and so it was home. It was foundational.
The pattern of gathering and harvesting set forth by earlier generations can be preserved and handed down. Today's community of neighbors is the heritage left to us by those who came before. The fertile fields upon which our ancestors gathered look different today. We make memories gathering at the sporting fields, the pickleball courts, church functions, concerts at the park, or at the farmer's market. Our ancestors gathered at the Holly store, building the White Church, celebrating the 24th of July, or flying down the sled hill. The field is different, but the harvest is the same.
I thought a little bit about what what was in existence for businesses in Mapleton, what people did besides farming, because so many were involved with farming. And there were some other things that people were employed by, but we had 2 blacksmith shops, the Jividens and Welby Warren. They both had a blacksmith shop, and they were right by each other, really. Yorth's had a fabrication shop. Then there was like the Holly store and a Harmer's Market. And that was about the extent of commercial operations in Mapleton.
My relationship to John Holly is that he is my dad's brother. And they were born in the family home here in Mapleton. There were 2 girls and 6 boys. And so John was a big part of our lives because he had a service station here with a candy counter, and he gave enough candy away to float a battleship, I think.
When I think of Holly's service station, that was almost an everyday stop because it was kind of a grocery store, but more of a convenience store in our gas station. He was a jolly old fellow that ran the store. He trusted everybody. I think he had a charge account for everybody. I know there was never a bill sent to anyone. He trusted them to pay their bill when they had it.
When my dad and I would hunt pheasants, we always ended up at John Holly's store. He had a big freezer in the back. It was full of ice and bottled drinks. People came there from everywhere, and John was just absolutely wonderful to everybody. Everybody loved John Holly.
The part about the community that's really important is that when people serve together, they learn to love each other. You get past all of the little criticalness and the pettiness, and you realize when you serve together how much you have in common and how much you care about each other. So serving and working together is really important.
I saw my father helping other farmers that needed it. There was just a sense of we're here for each other.
My grandpa Bennett, when he moved up here, he bought some acreage down on 1600 West, which was then called Sandy Lane. He had a wonderful big garden. I mean, it was a huge garden, but there was never a weed. He spent a lot of time in that garden. And he was, if people needed produce, he would share with them. I have a picture of him standing in his garden, leaning on the hoe. Behind him, all you can see is Maple Mountain. There's nothing, no houses, nothing.
We were just adopted by the community. It's just, they all just gathered us in and we went everywhere. The whole community was a family.
I love the service in this community. I love the way neighbors take care of neighbors. It's all about caring for each other and serving each other, and I love that about Mapleton.
In 1885, they allowed the people up here to hold Sunday school, and there were 2 Sunday schools in Mapleton. And then they built a church right on the side of where the old white church is now. It was a small church, had a curtain in the middle of it and a stove to keep it warm.
That white church was finished in 1938. It was the year I was born that it was finished.
The school district allowed us to hold church in the school building. We started there in 1934, and it was 1941 when we finally got it paid for so it could be dedicated. It was dedicated in April of 1941.
I found it interesting when Dad was talking about the building of the white church. It was really a community effort. We had families in the community who were not of the LDS faith that participated in the excavation and the building of the white church, and it was a real project. I didn't get to witness it, but just to hear him tell about the number of people that were involved with mixing cement and laying bricks and doing the excavation work and moving all the gravel, and it was a spirit of community effort that did that, and there was a lot of pride in doing that. He was on the city council at one time and was responsible for getting the city park leveled and planted and the trees in, and spearheaded that with scout groups and different community groups to help get the city park in. He always was good to be involved with that.
It was not individual families, it was a community family. Everybody cared for each other, and we looked out for each other, and we shared what we could.
The 24th of July was always a big thing. We would have a parade and then have the food in the park, and Dad was always involved in that with the Zions Club and the activities there. And I might just add that they always had hamburgers, and my dad made a relish in a huge big tub, and it was called the Holly Relish, and it just got really popular.
Everybody was involved. Oh, the 24th of July was just an exciting time.
Mapleton parades, the 24th of July parades, were a community event. There was no commercial floats. They were handmade floats, usually kids pulling wagons that had crepe paper around them. I remember kids putting clothespins on their bike frames with cards inserted into the spokes of the wheels. There was always all-star baseball teams. It wasn't until years later that you would see a band or something like that, but most of them was hand-pulled floats. And then after we got done with the parade, which lasted maybe 10, 15 minutes, we would go to the park, and that was when they were it was sponsored by the LDS Church. Most of the park activities, that's how they gained their budget money, was doing the 24th of July celebration.
My father was, for many years, the only police officer in town. He was chief of police.
Faye Jensen was the only law that Mapleton had, the only law Mapleton needed. He knew all our parents, and he knew all the kids. I don't think he used a book of tickets in a whole 20 or 30 years that he was the law in Mapleton. We didn't have any ambulances, we didn't have any fire trucks. He didn't have an office, he just had a cop car that he kept at his house.
Faye Jensen was, I guess every little rural town in the early days had their own police enforcement or whatever. He was our town cop or sheriff or whatever we wanted to call him. Faye was just a good guy that trusted everybody. Even though he was the long arm of the law, I know for a fact he never wore a gun. I don't think there was a lot going on in Mapleton that required what we call today as law and order. He was our only officer, just an easygoing guy. He got things done. I mean, we had a little old Mapleton jail cell. I don't know if anybody was ever in it except me.
I don't know what kind of a car he had at first, but he finally got a brand new car. It was an Edsel. It was a station wagon, and it had a gurney in the back, so therefore he became the person that anybody would call if they were hurt. So it was an ambulance. So he's the ambulance driver and the chief of police of Mapleton, and he worked on the fire department too, so.
Faye, he was very kind. He knew when to make you change what you were doing and behave yourself, but he always did it in a kind way.
If you didn't ever have the opportunity to slide down the Mapleton sled run, you missed out as a kid. They bought an old bus from Hill Air Force Base, and then they put a rack on the back. That's where you'd throw your sleighs, and then you jump in the bus, and they would bus you up to the Whiting's Park, and then you come down just a little bit. There's a gate, so it went from Whiting's Park down to there, and then they'd have a fire right there, and they'd have a turnaround, and you'd get on the bus there and go back up to the Whiting's Park.
The sleigh riding hill was absolutely probably the favorite thing of everybody in town. They would go up at night, and they would take the fire truck and they would squirt it down and get it really, really icy. Then it was really crazy, really fast. And then my Uncle John was the first one that got him a great big giant flexible flyer.
And so if you got on your flexible flyer, which was the sled of the time, if you made it to the bottom, you felt lucky, because there are times they clock people on those 4-man flexible flyers doing 70 miles an hour coming out of the bottom. So it was a super fast hill.
When they first started, you'd stack 2 or 3 people on the sleigh on top of each other. And somebody had a headlamp, they irrigated with them a little at that time, and somebody had the light, and you'd go down that sleigh riding hill and it's pitch black. And then later on, there was a guy here in town, old Frank Johnson, and he helped them get the lighting system for it, an old military generator, and they put lights down it after that. And you'd go up on a moonlit night, and that was the best, because it was just bright as day, and you'd really have a ball.
Over time, people have come and gone. The fields have changed, and even the crops. But the harvest will remain bountiful if we can sustain our unique heritage of service and sacrifice. What our children produce may not look the same as what our parents produced. So long as we preserve the community of neighbors, we will continue to nurture talent and innovation to shape the future.
If I were to sum up one word that describes Mapleton to me and what drew me here, it's definitely heritage. There's roots here and an invitation to put roots down.
Mapleton represents to me an ideal place to grow up and to raise a family. And I've often thought, as I've got a little older, I wish that my kids and my grandkids had a lot of the same experiences that I had growing up.
Oh, you know, Mapleton represents change to me because that's all it's done since I've been here, and it's still changing.
It was a great place to live. It was quiet, it was peaceful, it was a safe place to be. The environment was great. We let God take care of the climate and the global warming and the season changes, and we loved all of that, and we were happy.
It was a good place. Peaceful, because it always has been. The people here loved each other. I mean, you had to be good because everybody knew you know, and knew who you belonged to. I can honestly say that it hasn't changed in that respect.
I think that the people of Mapleton are just friendly people. Whether they've been here a long time or the ones who are relatively new, I would say, they can sense that. And there's just something about it that makes it a friendly place.
And 27 years ago when we moved here, it was a lot smaller, but I still feel like there is a sense of family within the community here. People look out for each other and are very willing to help each other and serve where they're needed, and there's a lot of love in this community.
Well, I'm going to be 70 years old in a couple of weeks, and that's how long I've been in Mapleton. I've seen a few changes. I'm thankful that my great-great-grandfather was some of the first settlers here, and the changes that have happened since that have been enormous, and I love Mapleton, and I like to share Mapleton with other people. It's a good place to live.
It's been wonderful to think about how my children have grown up here, how they've got these lasting relationships with people who are still here as well. They come home and they say, it's so changed, and yet it's exactly the same.
I've lived in Mapleton a total of 75 years out of my 82 years. So I've been here for a long time, but we built our home there 54 years ago, and that's where we raised our family, and that's where we watched all these changes that took place, progress. With that progress and with all those homes came some beautiful people that I would have never known had we not progressed to that point.
I'm very proud to be able to say that I'm a third-generation Mapleton person that is still able to live here because of the development that has happened. I don't love that Mapleton is so big anymore, but I'm grateful that the development has taken place, because if it hadn't, I wouldn't be able to have a home here.
Mapleton's always been a good place to live. There's a good spirit and good attitude here. And fortunately, that's been carried forward with many new people that have moved in. I think they've picked up that spirit.
When you're from Mapleton, you just can't get away from it.
I hope that the new generation, and even my generation, can appreciate the sacrifices and the fortitude that it took to build this city and make it what it is today. And even though maybe it's growing a little faster than what some of the older residents prefer, I think it's only a credit to them that so many people want to live here because it is such a great place to live.